Hello and welcome everyone. This is the seventh and final reflection session on COVID and the call to faith. This series of panel discussions is sponsored by the Catholic Bishops of Alberta and the Northwest Territories. My name is Alan Schietzsch. I'm the webmaster for the Catholic Archdiocese of Edmonton, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's panel discussion. This panel is part of a series of reflection sessions inspired by a pastoral letter released by our bishops on the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. The letter was titled, "Save Your People, O Lord, and Bless Your Inheritance," a pastoral statement on the impact of COVID-19 and the call to Christian renewal. In their pastoral letter, the bishops invite Catholics from across the province and territories to consider the impact of COVID-19 within their homes, schools, workplaces, and society in general, especially in light of the gospel and the social teachings of the Church. For example, questions like, how have you lived your faith during this time of pandemic? Which values, attitudes, and behaviors have been most dear to you and will you want to hold on to going forward? And also, which may be in need of remedy or renewal? These are questions we want to engage our panelists here today. So today's topic is the value and dignity of human work. To help guide our reflection on this theme, we've assembled an exceptional panel of Catholic leaders in specific ministry fields to touch upon the theme directly and have been impacted by the pandemic in particular ways. Joining us in conversation today are Joan Hertz, a respected lawyer and consultant who serves as chair of the ATB Financial Board of Directors. Thanks, Joan. Economist Mark Anielski, the President and Chief Wellbeing Officer of Anielski Management here in Edmonton. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
We have Ricardo Morales, who's Manager of Community Development and Integration Services with the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. Hello, Ricardo.
Thank you, Alan. Hello.
And Dr. Eugenia Paniata-Kowalchuk, who serves as Executive Director for the Alberta Catholic School Trustees Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by quoting the bishop's reflection text on today's theme. Our bishops write, "It may be many years before the total impact of the pandemic is truly known in our province, our territory, our country, and the wider world. What is certain, however, is that COVID continues to influence economics around the world and create a number of unprecedented situations bearing on human labor, such as large-scale and forced periods of unemployment, new work environments requiring rapid adaptation. We've had that ourselves. Extraordinarily heavy demands placed upon essential sectors of human service. Some areas of the economy have been particularly hard hit by the crisis and may never recover, leaving many people deeply worried about their future livelihoods. The Church herself has not been exempt from facing many of these same challenges. In many instances, we've witnessed great efforts made to preserve and uphold the essential value of employment and the dignity of workers. In other situations, employment conditions during the pandemic have brought our awareness of the basic moral tenets of just employer-employee relations. Our Christian response has been, and always must be, to promote the value and dignity of human work for individuals, their families, and the local communities where they and we live and serve. So that with the background provided for us by the bishops, I'd like to begin with our first question for the panel today. How has COVID-19 affected the conditions of your work life and family? What has this experience taught you about the nature, value, and dignity of your own work, as well as that of others? Who would like to start?
I'd love to start.
Thank you.
In many ways, COVID hasn't changed my work life. I've been working from home ever since I left the Alberta government in 1999. So as a consultant to nations and First Nations and clients, my focus has been on measuring well-being. And so my clients have been as remote as China to the First Nation, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, the PA. So I could still do my work as an economist and building their balance sheets and measuring their well-being from the luxury of my my little ashram office here. My wife and I both work at home. She works with victims of violent crime as a mediator. So it's affected her. She can't go into the prisons anymore because they've been locked out. But the interesting thing is, with the technology of Zoom, and in some ways, we're actually more efficient in our use of our time, and we can share information more readily, more efficiently than it was true when you were sitting together in the same room. So those are some of my observations about and my own experience. So, and of course, the other thing that some of us have been touched with is the CERB money that's come in, which I consider an act of mercy. My American friends don't have that luxury. So Canada did the right thing, it seems, to save many of us from despair, economic disaster. So though it's cost us an enormous, it's loaded Canada's debt to the tune of another $400 billion in 6 months, which is only now showing up on the national balance sheet or the Bank of Canada's balance sheet. So this is a big problem as an economist. So.
Yeah, that's something, we can't not deal with, and yet we're between a rock and a hard place, aren't we?
Yeah.
What do you find, Eugenia?
Well, I found that typically we would be working in an office, and when March rolled around, we quickly made the decision at ACSTA to begin working from home. So, of course, looking at our technology needs and how we were going to be able to continue working and communicating with one another became really, really important. I know that for myself, it affected not only me personally, but also professionally, because now we were working from home, but it was a completely different landscape that was before us. A landscape that challenged us personally, also because many of us had children and many of us were also caring for elderly parents. So that complexity of the day and the anxiety that went with all of that, as we know that our elderly are much more vulnerable to COVID, really added a layer of, really taking care of yourself, because if you're not healthy, then you can't really help those that count on you and will need you more in the future. So that was a bit complex. As you know, in education, it was overnight, really, that the decision was made that all of a sudden we would be going to a virtual learning environment. And again, when we speak about being patient and really persevering and leaning on each other, that situation just spoke of all those elements, because it had to be such a team approach moving forward that it would just be an impossible mission for individuals to do alone. So that whole, the beauty of our faith that calls us to work in community with one another really became evident as schools had to really change the course of how they delivered education. And we know, in fact, that the piece that became most problematic and was worrying the general population is how is this affecting our young people, that now how are we going to provide for them the relationships that we often took for granted within the classroom and the school community. So those were some of the challenges, but it also, those challenges helped us realize the importance of school, of work, and of family, and provided a little bit of balance and insight for all of us to reflect upon.
Yeah, that's got to be a huge challenge, and to provide faith and particularly hope to young people in a time uncertain as this. It's unusual, I'm sure, for them to see the adults in their lives under stress and knowing not really any more than they do. Mm-hmm. So quite a challenge to retain our sense of control and help for people. Now, how about you, Rick?
Thanks, Alan. It's I'm going to put this in a little philosophical trend and then probably get down to the impacts at Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, where I'm presently working. I think one of the first things that came to mind for me is the fact that I was reading the Christian hymn written in 1773 by William Cowper from England that state, "The Lord moves in mysterious ways." And I think sometimes when we were first impacted by COVID-19, one of the first tendencies were people to look out and start blaming and looking for answers. I think that in our culture we have such a linear way of thinking that we tend to see events that are occurring in our lives that are sometimes beyond our understanding, and sometimes we can't really fathom what God has planned from us from the beginning to the end. And when we look at the impact of what was happening, and I'll speak specifically in our context, there were many people that were questioning and began, even doubting how they're going to deliver some of these programs. In my capacity as Director for Community Development and Integration Services and Southern Alberta Rural Settlement Projects, we have a cluster of programs that are, again, geared towards meeting the needs of some of the most vulnerable sectors in our population. As an organization, CCIS remained open during the inception of COVID. We put a lot of protocols in place, and we knew that we had over 600 of the most vulnerable refugees to look after. So it was placing our needs and our personal needs, kind of below some of what we know that our clients had to deal with. And I think that when we take a look at the nature of work, it certainly showed that there are a lot of sacrifices that were being made by others. Even though people question how we were going to do things, I challenge staff to think, if you woke up today and this was your reality, how would you begin reframing and approaching work? I think it was a great time for us to reaffirm our faith in each other, reaffirm our faith in God, reaffirm our connections with family in different ways, and look at ways in which we could provide added support. Because I don't think in times like this, it's a time when we could all probably run and hide. I think even though many people do have concerns about personal safety, I think what I saw that was a most admirable behavior that's coming out from folks is people's willingness to sacrifice and to support others.
That's interesting because in my preparation for this, I was reading a bit, and one of the things that stuck out to me was a letter with the early church fathers, probably in the 1st or 2nd century, that was where someone was speaking about what are Christians like, these new revolutionary culture that's taking over the world. And they were saying, well, they live in our lands, whatever the country, and they're just like us. But how do they express themselves? And one of the ways was through they do their work, whatever their work is, as a carpenter, a fisherman, whatever it is, but with a Christian motivation and ethos behind it. So what you said speaks very deeply to that.
Yeah, and I think, Alan, that had to come to the forefront. I mean, as an organization, part of our vision statement is we welcome, they came to us as strangers and we welcome them. But you have so many people that are coming who are disenfranchised, who are marginalized, who have faced so many different multi-layered barriers and experiences that we sometimes ask them to be resilient. And if we don't model resiliency in times of our challenges, I think we wouldn't be holding true to our faith.
Very much. What have you found, Joan?
Well, I'll build on that a bit. When COVID hit, I was president and CEO of Norquest College, which has 20,000 students and 900 employees. And I learned so much through that process about leadership. And when faced with a crisis like this, and to build on what you both have just been talking about, is so you can decide as a leader to act out of fear, or really try and dig deep and live your values. And I think that that was the thing. And I had a lot of leaders calling me in this time period for advice. And I think all of us that chose instead to not wait for someone to tell us what to do, not wait for a government regulation, not wait for an order of what to do with our workers, but instead to say, how would we live our values and how would we support each other to very quickly move to online and to support each other, as you said, Eugenia, through all the mental health challenges that we all took on. So I think that was one that, for me, leaders learning to live their values. And I think the second big adjustment was all of us just suddenly doing this. Like, how many on-screen meetings had you done where you had to try and connect and try and engage with the people across from you? Not very many. I mean, I do lots of teleconferences and whatever, but not all day in and day out. And what I found was a really great thing was seeing people in their, I call it their personal habitat. Like, you really got to know people and you almost built personal connection very quickly because you could see little people, you could see, pets, you might see, photographs or something or a crucifix, something that expressed the individuality. And I found people of faith that I didn't know were around me in some of my, corporate experience. So I think that, and then again, choosing to treat each other in that situation as a human who's having difficulty with a pet or a dog barking or a child crying or whatever. And just I think all of us getting down to the humanity and treating each other with respect was another big learning for everyone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know that quite a few people have expressed to me, although the times of COVID are challenging, that there is a silver lining, and discovering those connections, through our work with other humans, I think that does speak to the human dignity portion and our interrelationships, which also have, of course, an economic component. The next question I have is very related to that, and I'm going to ask Mark for this because it almost falls exactly to what you were explaining your field was, and that is, what questions or lessons has the pandemic surfaced for you about the ways in which we relate to economic structures in our church and in society?
Economic structures in our church. Well, that's a loaded.
Well, it's not just structures in our church, but how do we relate to economic structures in our church?
Well, I know.
So as Christians.
Well, that's a big subject that I've explored in my faith journey. It's actually my 20th anniversary of not joining the priesthood or being a monk when I went to Jerusalem. 28 years to the day, actually. It was young.
Wow.
Yeah, and in the old city, and I thought I heard my calling was to re-enter the temple of economics, and my prayer was, Lord, why did you chase the money changers of the temple with such rage? So the rest of my life, I've studied the nature, the history and nature of economics, of accounting, of banking, of money. And this COVID, I call it a situation, because we have to be careful about language, the word pandemic, like break it apart. So I'm a student of language, and I see that from my time as a business professor at U of A, and as economists, we've kind of inverted the language. The word economy means household management or stewardship. The word mortgage means a death pledge. Everyone laughs when I say that. It's like, yeah, well, that's what we give people when they have a house. Competition in Latin, to strive together. Even the language in banking, they're all water metaphors: currency, liquidity, banks. Wow. So, as a child, in my own inquiry into economics was the question, why? Why does money always have to be scarce? Oh, suddenly we have a pandemic, and suddenly the government just created $400 billion of new debt money to shower into our bank accounts within a few days of applying for CERB. Isn't it interesting? Before the pandemic, it was hard to finance, right? Basic social services. People would complain about paying a living wage. Can't do that, can't afford it. And suddenly, miracles. We have manna flowing from the skies. So the question I've asked is, how is it that from the basis of accounting, which is 500 years old, going back to Venice and Luca Pacioli, Leonardo da Vinci, the money systems, that we have not had the courage to do what we're doing today, which is to design an economy in which everyone receives a fair and living wage, has the dignity of meaningful work, because work brings us meaning and joy, hopefully. 13% of Canadian workers, according to Gallup, said only 13% were getting meaning from their work, right? That is a shockingly low number. And so all of these pieces in my mind have led to the critique of the structural injustices of a money system that is debt-based, mortgaged in the truest sense, does not provide the fair and liquidity for our basic corporeal needs, and therefore is a destroyer of true happiness. The word happiness in Greek, well-being of the soul. How dare we, who are managers of the system, have not spoken out against this injustice? And now in this pandemic, we seem to have woken up, maybe, to the realities of this injustice. And what do we do as church, as individuals, as people who sit on audit committees or chairmen of banks, right? What are we going to do on Monday? That's courageous, loving, as Christ taught, that economy of love that he, I think, gave us. Anyways, I'm off my platform, so that's...
Well, it really speaks to what are we measuring here? Yeah, and how does it bring us dignity? Yeah.
Right.
Well, I kind of feel like I have to respond now. You threw it out to the
I know,
chairman of the
Joan,
bank. That is me. I think it's been interesting, though, that the lessons that we've learned, you said, about economic structures and what you just said there is money lost importance, though. Money lost importance, and the focus on what was important. I feel like humanity just, for the first time, and I don't know, probably ever in my life anyway, everything kind of faded away. And what people were most fearful of was actually not their economic well-being. It was something else. And so I think what I found fascinating now, though, I have to speak from that sort of bigger corporate perspective, because if you, even a year or 2 years ago, many CEOs, Larry Fink of BlackRock, who's one of the largest investment banks in the world, and many of the CEOs jointly signing on to letters about how it's not just about profit, it's about purpose. So I do think that that this wave had already begun, and I believe that this pandemic is going to be one of those defining moments for all of us. But I saw corporate corporate North America really awakening to this profit with a purpose, and to what is our corporate social responsibility at that highest level. And if they're talking about that and where they're going to invest their capital and how they're going to make those kinds of decisions, it will then collide and hopefully come together with what we're talking about here today, which is the value of work for all. But I do think I was impressed with that, and we've seen it. I'm also very involved with governance, and we've seen the evolution of governance. The government actually put into our Canada Business Corporations Act that if you're making a big decision as a board, you can't just think about the short-term profit of this company. You actually have to think about your employees, the environment, long-term effects of what you're doing, and they listed all those kinds of factors. These are big changes. These are big societal kind of changes that I see happening in sort of the higher levels of corporate finance. So that's what we're doing at chairman of the bank. And I don't think that we're all the way there, Mark, but Rome wasn't built in a day.
Well, just one more shout out for ATB, Alberta Treasury Branch, is Canada's only provincial public bank. That's kudos to Alberta.
Yeah, and I could brag about some of the really cool things that we're doing to try and humanize what we're all going through right now, but it's still banking. There's still credit. There's still debts being called on, and this is very, very hard for people. People are losing their jobs and their businesses, and this is, I can't understate that is very difficult, and I feel it, I know that.
So I thanks a lot, folks. I just want to kind of jump in and probably deviate a bit, but it raised some intriguing questions and some ponderings. And as I started to look at the economics impact in society, and again, I'm putting it in the context of those clients who subscribe to our organization, nonprofit. And I started to look at the inequities in society, and this statement that's percolating: we're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And we begin to examine social and economic influences on people's health. It's bringing about to me a greater amount of inequities, and there's certain specific groups that are impacted, and these are certainly having some broader determinants on health. I took a look at a stats produced by Stats Canada, and it says 17.6% of visible minorities and immigrants were impacted in terms of unemployment. It's grown. Conversely, 9.5% or thereabouts, not specific, but something in that range of mainstream white Canadians were impacted in terms of their unemployment. So obviously, when you start looking at the data and the economics, there's some inequalities or inequities that are percolating as a result of this. When I take a look at income and social status, and I found it very ironic that some of the industries that are claiming profits are some of the industries that are dependent upon more migrant laborers. I look at the food chains, I look at the type of workers that are not paid the big bucks, but yet they are in the front line, and I want to classify them as essential workers. When you take a look at some of the folks working in our stores and our pharmacies, I start looking at the disparity in terms of what they're earning and what those industries are claiming. We had to deal with, as an organization, we dealt with one of the single most largest outbreaks during COVID with the Cargill. I know my role in that was running logistics and heading up a community response team. And we certainly saw the impact on workers in that particular field. And yet, some of them were striving to continue going to work despite the risks and dangers that they face. But yet, on the other hand, while they experienced some blame and shame in the community because the community was fearful that there was going to be community spread, there was a feeling in that community that if that plant remained closed, it was going to impact the agricultural sector. So during COVID, I am just kind of observing some disparities in terms of the economics, in terms of who is more greatly impacted and who is also profiting. I'm also looking at employment and working conditions among some of the vulnerable sectors. Someone on the panel spoke about the impact on education and literacy, and how are vulnerable populations coping with restructuring of delivery of education. As a former principal, I am concerned, and in my capacity, I am concerned that some students and some families may be left behind because of some of the new deliveries in terms of how education is being delivered. So there are some of those economic, what I call collateral pieces that I am noticing that I think has could have a great impact on some of the vulnerable sectors in society.
Some good observations there. I mean, I not with knowledge of the subject, but just what I can imagine from what you said, I could see, for example, okay, schools are online. Now, can the parents go to work because the kids are now at home? Can those people afford, computers or internet connections or whatever to even do that? Never mind the working situation now of people who are in the educational system. And how do they handle this new situation? So yeah, it goes through all of us. What about you, Eugenia? You look like you might have an observation there.
Well, I think it's interesting to note that in our schools, when they went to a virtual online platform, The concern was, how are we going to continue serving through our school systems and through our school communities the most vulnerable? That was through food hampers or lunch programs. It was a real concern. How are we going to reach that population in our schools where we could still serve? And we saw many examples on social media, and through Grandin Media did a few stories, as well as Catholic trustees were teaming up with different school divisions and putting together thousands of hampers for families. And schools that were trying to organize lunch so that families could come in and pick up a lunch and food hampers. So when we look at that economic structure, it's present in whatever form you can articulate it, but it is present in our communities, and it is a form of inequity that we address, but we don't really address. We try to create structures where people are self-sufficient and where the dignity of the human person is found, but we also realize that the dignity of the human person is also found in work, because that is really a big part of our identity. I mean, we go to work every day, there's a dollar value attached and that. And so really, I think it hit home when Pope Francis just released his latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, and he really emphasized that every person has the right to live with dignity and to develop himself or herself completely. So looking at our economic structures, and as leaders, how are we enabling our people to work and to find a living that will support them, and maintain that human dignity element? Because I think it challenges us during times of pandemic to find new solutions, new ways of looking at structures, and really testing ourselves in terms of being good stewards of our resources, whether they be financial, whether they be human, or whether they are spiritual. I think it really has called us to action in really empowering all people so that they can serve God and they can feed their families.
That's quite an observation. There was an interview with an atheist journalist, Eugenio Scalfari, that Pope Francis did in the newspaper La Repubblica. He said in that interview that the two biggest social evils that need to be addressed are the loneliness of the old and the unemployment of the young.
Mm-hmm.
And that they're obviously, those two things that Pope Francis was talking about are all the more critical during COVID. He said the young need work, and they have neither one nor the other. And the problem is they don't even look for them anymore because they've been crushed by the presents. Mm-hmm. Can you live like crushed under the weight of the present? Can you go on living like this? Those were the Pope's comments. And he also attacked what he called unjust salaries. Mm-hmm. So, that kind of prompts us to think that, obviously you brought up some of the panelists, the CERB payments, things like that. Could we do something similar to, create jobs? And then, if the government is paying for them, but we give people jobs for the dignity of their work, then all of a sudden now the employer isn't paying for them because the government is. So does that free up some economic space, for, well, I'm not sure what, might achieve our ends of faith and dignity and moving forward together. What experiences do each of you have that might speak to that?
Well, I could speak to my analysis of living wages. Mm-hmm. And so for Alberta, based on my pre-COVID math, about 35% of the households were not earning a living wage. What's a living wage? It's about $18 an hour for an individual in Calgary or Edmonton. In my survey work, if I asked Albertans how do you feel you make sufficient income to meet your life needs? Well, in my analysis in the town of Olds, I found that 33% of the population said no, I did not feel I made enough. So interesting, right? Matching those numbers between the objective statistics and the perception. What is our responsibility to pay a living wage? You know, CERB amounted to effectively a quasi-living wage, right? And I've been advising the finance minister federally and associate finance minister about this question. How did Canadians experience CERB? How did they feel emotionally, physically, spiritually through the CERB? Was it sufficient? And the Bank of Canada governor said looks like about only 70% of that CERB money was actually spent, and savings rates have gone from 3 to 6% in those few months. So interesting questions from an economic, fiscal perspective. So one of the questions I'm wrestling is, why is it so hard for us, either as individual business people, to pay the living wage? We'll say, well, we can't afford to because we can barely keep the lights on. Should it be imposed by governments, or should it simply be an awareness, a conscious awareness that this is actually what it costs to live in the society? And yet Albertans, before COVID, the average Edmonton household was making about $109,000. Now the happiness wage, statistically, they say is around $75,000. So we've got, and then yet there's this, as Ricardo said, there's this inequity. There's an unequal distribution of income and wealth and well-being. So those are things I've been sort of studying and trying to figure out, well, how do we deal with this? And there's maybe some interesting creative ways. CERB showed us that, I've said from a tax perspective, we might actually increase the personal exemption up to $20,000, not 12, and thereby actually giving people effectively a living wage, whether you're working or you're disabled or you're on pension. So those fiscal things we'll have to be discussing seriously, I think, in the months ahead.
Mark, I'm not an economist, but you raised some very interesting insights for me to ponder some more, because I'm thinking that, there was certainly found money that came about to provide some relief for those that are in need. But my question is, at what cost? Because I still have a feeling, an inkling, that at some point in time, folks are going to have to pay the piper. And this scares me, because there's so many, again, I go back to our context. We have some clients who are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, just to provide for the family, but also, again, adding to what work means. You suddenly have people trying to attain, if you go back to the old Maslowian hierarchy, there's some basic needs that have to be met, and certainly there's some people with the intrinsic need for work. But my concern is the fact that there are some industries that were collecting supports from government, and yet that money wasn't getting down to the employees. So while the industry was trying to keep afloat and laid off some of the employees were the ones that were suffering. So again, it points to another disparity in terms of this whole economic structure for me.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Ricardo. I just updated on LinkedIn my Bank of Canada and federal government quarterly numbers. And consider this, before COVID, the total national debt was $750 billion. It took from 1974 to 2019 to amass $750 billion. We've just added $400 billion to that number in 5 months. Who holds the debt? Who do we owe it to? Not on CBC News, not even in the discourse right now. So you're right. It's like someone's going to pay the piper, and the provinces are just as badly off. So we've got, and of course, I know what the magic wand is I would wave, but that's not going to happen unless there's an honest discussion about where are we going, because if we have another year of pandemic, we're going to add another 400 billion, unless we're going to court absolute pandemonium. So interesting, tough questions.
Yeah, it's a changing world. In September of 2013, Pope Francis linked human ecology with the environment. So he said that work must be combined with the preservation of creation so that this may be responsibly safeguarded for future generations. Creation is not a good to be exploited, but a gift to look after. He said that, works on things like new energy, which that especially speaks to the huge changes that are happening in Alberta, the prevention and removal of different forms of pollution, being alert to forest fires and natural disasters which are happening. How may caring for creation and looking after man through dignified work be a common task in our human ecology and economy?
Well, I would be, one of the things that I was talking about in that profit for purpose, the evolution of that as well is what they call ESG, so environmental, social, and governance becoming important aspects about how we decide where big things like who owns our paper, right? Who owns the debt of our country? Who owns the debt of our large energy producers in Alberta? And more, with all of the money that's being put forward by governments around the world to stimulate their economies again, we're seeing them tying it to this ESG. We're seeing that, actually, Alan, they don't know they're following the Pope's ecology and encyclical, but they are. And there's just this heightened awareness to what are the implications for the environment of doing this, and also social governance. And I would say, as Albertans, it's very important that we continue to advocate for inclusivity, that there be inclusion of our Indigenous peoples, of all people of BIPOC, all people who are not traditionally in many of these industries. But I think we're making headway on that. So we have to continue to push that, because that's the S and G, that would be the social and the governance, where I think we're doing better than some other countries. E, we have some work to do, let's be honest, because the oil sands have their challenges, but then we're doing these carbon capture things. We're working with technology to try and say, so how could we do it more ecologically? We're looking at small modular nuclear reactors. We are exploring other things that might be cleaner energy in the future. So I think we need to continue to advocate as leaders for these things to be considered. But the thing I didn't hear in that, as well as ecology, is education. And I think the tie to education is the path to freedom, and education is the path to that living wage. And I feel like in this economic discussion that we seem to be having in Alberta and in the country, they're not talking about that enough. We're cutting post-secondary funding, and I was obviously very close to it this spring when it was happening. And we had, had private donors supporting us to get laptops into the hands of our students who needed to learn online. Really? Like, it seems to me at this time, this is when we should be upskilling all our workforce. This is when we should be inviting all those people who are on the front line, who may have lost their jobs, or who are in the mid-levels that are not qualified for the economy of the future that we're going to need to be ready for. So I just have to put out there that I think support for individuals who'd like to go back to school post-secondary, how can we support all of the people to be included in the post-secondary system?
That speaks to the next question, and we're beginning to come close to our close. We've got like 5 or 10 minutes left, and that's, as we move forward together, what activities should our church or our bishops undertake to promote a just economic recovery and renewal of dignity and respect in the workplace? Are there any messages that you have, or that or suggestions that could be done that would help move us forward there?
Well, I'm going to big plug for Saint Pope John Paul II, who said our commission, he said in 2003, is to build a civilization of love. Sounds like a big word, civilization, love. And I would feel compelled to, as I am an advisor of the Archbishop, to think about Alberta as a model for this emerging civilization of love, based on the notion that well-being is the ultimate goal of our economy. And if not the church, who's going to show us that this path to economy of well-being and a civilization of love is possible, and through compassion, through all the things we talked about today, through education, the truest Latin sense, to draw forth what's already within you. So that would be my big plug, I guess.
And
thank you very much, Mark. That's really timely. That brings our panel discussion to a close. I'd really like to thank Joan, Mark, Ricardo, and Eugenia for your conversation and all your insights today, and for the work that all of you do to strengthen and contribute through our Catholic community. While this may be the last of this video series, our bishops hope that this is just the start for our audience as well as ourselves. We're all each encouraged to hold our own similar reflections in our homes, schools, workplaces, and societies, and our families everywhere. Reflection guides prepared by the bishops, complete with questions to ponder, and recommended readings on today's topic can be found online at grandinmedia.ca. If any of you in the audience would like to provide bishops with the comments or feedback on this topic, your thoughts, or on any of the themes presented in the pastoral letter, they encourage you to let them know via feedback email on the website, which is COVID-19, all one word, at grandinmedia.ca. They'd love to receive your thoughts. And again, thank you to all our panelists. I know that we're all going away with lots to think about and to reflect on, and to grow in living our walk of faith together. So please join me in our concluding prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty and eternal God, our refuge in every danger, to whom we turn in our distress. In faith we pray. Look in compassion on the afflicted. Grant eternal rest to the dead, comfort to mourners, healing to the sick, peace to the dying, strength to all workers, and wisdom to our leaders, and the courage to reach out to all in compassion and love, so that together we may give glory to your holy name. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.